We're good to go.
All right. Welcome everybody to our TMN Tuesday event for March. Today we have a wonderful program that I know many Master Naturalists are really excited and interested in hearing about as they engage in their stewardship of resources and then their interpretation and education of those resources with the public. So as we get started here today, we're going to kick off with a little bit of virtual meeting room etiquette, as we always do. Just to set the ground level, if you are new here as a Master Naturalist, just joining your first TMN Tuesday, welcome. We're excited to see so many trainees. And if you've been through this before, you know we always say these virtual meeting room etiquette notes just to, again, make sure that everybody's starting off on the same page. We do have a help guide on our website, so if you are having additional issues with WebEx as it goes through its different updates, you can check out that help guide on our website. For the conversation that we're going to have with our speakers today, we're going to use the chat function. As an attendee, you cannot unmute or share your video, but you can chat with us, and Michelle and Hannah and I will all be moderators of that chat today. Help us out with that chat by keeping it on topic, respectful, and professional. Also use your best grammar, spelling, and avoid acronyms if you can, so we can make sure we're asking the questions that you intend to be asked of our speakers today. If you're a Master Naturalist here joining us, as these TMN Tuesdays are open to the public, but if you're a Master Naturalist, you can log today for an advanced training hour. Check in with your VMS coordinator on the process for doing so, but we have 1 hour of advanced training that you can get through watching today's program, either live or as a recording. Speaking of the recording, we are recording today's program, and it will be on our website by this afternoon, if not first thing tomorrow morning. You can also watch that recording for advanced training if you're not here with us live today. As I said, attendees are not able to unmute or share their video, and we have lots of resources on our website, and that's that QR code there that Hannah's got, and I'll drop it in the chat so that everybody can grab it as well. All right, now you can go to the next slide, Hannah. To help support future events like this, we ask, as you're participating in our webinar series, to complete this short survey. It's a voluntary survey. It helps us to gather information as we're putting on concurrent webinars like this, and we'll also drop that link in the chat. I do see that there's some folks in the chat saying that there is no sound. Again, if you're seeing us talk but you're not hearing anything, you'll need to check your audio. And so hopefully there's somebody in the chat that can help get you pointed that direction, because you can't hear me tell you to go there. All right, so I'm going to drop that link in the chat, and Hannah, I'm going to kick it over to you to tell us about what's coming up next.
All right, we have some quick updates for these next 2 slides. The first one is our April TMN Tuesday event, which is our virtual volunteer fair. You'll notice something different. We now have a time listed. So the event will be held on April 8th from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. So go ahead and save that block on your calendar. I have not made the WebEx registration for that yet, but that will be live either end of this week, early next week, something like that. And along with that, we'll have more information on who's presenting and what that day will look like. So be on the lookout for that email coming out on the listserv. If you want to check out what we have on the page right now, you can use that QR code there. But as mentioned, full agenda and details coming soon, including that registration link. So just hang tight for that. The next item is the annual meeting. As you've probably noticed, we have launched our call for proposals. So if you are interested in presenting at the annual meeting, or you know someone who you really want to present at the annual meeting, either submit a proposal or send them that email that you saw over the listserv, or direct them to our website for them to submit a proposal. But we are accepting those now. You can use that QR code to go to the website, or you can plug in that link into your web browser. And you'll see on the top of that page, there's a little graphic that shows different things. The megaphone, you can click that, it takes you right down to the call for proposals section of that. But go ahead and also save those dates, October 16th through 19th, and it's going to be a lot of fun. And Michelle, I'm handing it off to you now.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to introduce you today to Benjamin Anderson and Lindsay Garza, who they both are licensing and permitting specialists with Texas Parks and Wildlife. And today they are going to talk to us about Stewards and Statutes, the legal side of Texas wildlife education. So I'm going to turn it over to y'all, Ben and Lindsay, and stop sharing, and then y'all can share your presentation.
Thank you, Michelle. I'm going to go ahead and just get my screen share all set up. Just one second here.
Hi, everyone.
Okay, it's loading. In the meantime, just as an introduction while I'm waiting on my screen share to work here, as Michelle said, my name is Benjamin Anderson. I have been with the department for about 5.5 years, and I am a licensing and permitting specialist for the department. And what that means for me currently and what I've been doing for the past few years with the department is I administer a few permit programs. Those permit programs include the educational display permit, which we are going to be talking about today, the scientific permit for research, the zoological permit, and then I also do a few permits related to threatened and endangered plants. I have some connections with the Master Naturalist program through my work in the sense that I have, over the past few years as I've been administering this program is, there are more than a handful of Master Naturalists out there that need permits to conduct the activities that they do in line with their duties as a Master Naturalist. So that's my main interface with the Master Naturalist program is I'm providing guidance to Master Naturalists, and in the case where they do choose to apply for a permit, I'm helping them out through that process. And Lindsay, I can turn it over to you if you want to give a quick introduction as well.
Sure. So I've been with the department since 2019, so about 6 years now, and some of the main programs that I administer are going to be the falconry program for Texas, the wildlife rehabilitation program, non-game dealer, fur bearing propagation. Those are the big ones. I've got about 4 others that I'm also administering to, which don't have as many permit holders, so it doesn't take up as much of my time, but those are the main ones.
So Lindsay and I oversee a wide variety of permit programs across the state, and the main one that we feel like is going to be especially relevant to Texas Master Naturalists is the educational display permit. But of course, Lindsay's here also to talk about the important rehabilitation permit, and I'll let her speak on that later in this presentation. But I'm going to get us started, and just to make sure, Lindsay, you can see my presentation or whatnot. We're good to go.
I can see it, Ben.
Okay, just wanted to make sure we were all set here. Okay, so to start, or I should say before we get started, I'd like to just go over the general sort of objectives and what I would really like, Master Naturalists to be able to walk away from this presentation with. Firstly is understanding relevant laws and regulations, especially as they pertain to wildlife education. This is really important because it can or will ensure that, when you're being compliant and when you need a permit, something that I encounter on a day-to-day basis in my position is uncertainty within the community. And that's not specific to Master Naturalists. That's uncertainty within all across Texas, right? People don't know when they do and don't need a permit. They don't understand what the permits do and what they don't need a permit for. So, what I hope you can walk away from after this presentation is confidence that you are compliant and that you understand when you do and don't need a permit. But I also hope that, this would empower you to be able to speak more confidently with the public about the various rules and regulations pertaining to wildlife education. And then, another benefit of this presentation is it's going to help protect you as an individual and your chapter from any unintentional violations. I think both Lindsay and I can attest to that something we encounter on a day-to-day basis is people committing violations, and we talk to them and they have no clue whatsoever that they've done something wrong. Another thing I hope you can walk away from with, I should say, is an understanding of what the department is looking for, and hopefully some recommendations for how you can implement permits with your chapters. We want to help you navigate and understand the permit process. We want to hopefully clarify our expectations from our department's perspective, and then just also streamline this process for each individual chapter. These things can be very complicated when you don't know much, but I think the more you learn about these programs is you can begin to understand that these programs are really straightforward in a sense. I think the hardest part is just understanding what the various laws, rules, and policies are. And once you have a solid understanding of that, I think things become a lot easier. And additionally, we can also go over today what an educational display permit does for you. And aside from when it's like strictly required, there could be other benefits to receiving a permit that we'll go over, and how that can benefit chapters, even if it's not strictly required. And then it will go into how can you as a chapter manage these permits effectively, and who's going to be responsible, or who should be, or what we would recommend as far as that goes in terms of responsibility for managing the permits within each individual each individual chapter. And then later in the presentation, I'm going to turn it over to Lindsay so that she can give an overview of the wildlife rehabilitation permit. I think it's important that I share how I arrived at this information. I don't want anyone to take this as something that I have solely decided is going to be the case. Rather, this is something that I've come to after conversations with law enforcement, parks and wildlife colleagues, biologists, and our program leadership. We're lucky to have Assistant Commander Kevin Winters on the call today if we ever need him to clarify anything from a law enforcement perspective. I've also, over the years, have built up, knowledge of some real world applications and experience. And what I've done for this presentation is I've combined those experiences along with these conversations with our staff to really streamline this guidance and hopefully just really hit on what the important points are. And the reasons why we think this is important for master naturalists is it lends itself to your own legal protection and can enhance your educational impact and expand your educational capabilities. Just to go through a few disclaimers before we get into it is, one, rules can be interpreted in many different ways, and gray areas exist and are frankly prolific within these programs. What some people may have heard 5 or 6 years ago may be different than what I'm presenting today. And I've talked to our constituents about that, where they they come to me and they say, well, this isn't what I was told years and years ago. And so that is a disclaimer, is that over time our interpretation of these laws and rules can change, and all these regulations are subject to change and have changed over the years. To be honest, a lot of these rules related to education and with wildlife often go unchanged, though. I was looking through a few of our rules just to see when the last time they were updated, and I saw many that haven't been updated since 1997, just to give you an impression of how old some of these rules can be. Not to say that none of them have been updated, but certainly some of these are in do need of some changes and updates. These permit programs will also be evolving over time. Our department is leading an effort to really introduce all these permit programs into the online interface. A lot of these permit programs, and the ones we're going to be talking about today, are really paper-driven processes. And so as we move these programs online, things could change. Policies or application requirements, these could change over the years. And so all that is to say, while this presentation provides current guidance, always verify with us when in doubt. And if years from now, you saw this presentation and it's been several years and you decide you need a permit for whatever reason, it might be a good time to check in with our department. One other thing is that, we're only going to be talking about a few programs here, really the educational permits and the rehabilitation permits. There could be situations where other permit programs become involved. Just as an example, our Inland Fisheries Division manages various aquatic exotic species permits. And while I'm mainly going to be talking about indigenous wildlife today, there could be situations where in the course of educational activities, you may need other permits, and I can't cover all of those different permits. I'm really focusing on the main one that I think is going to be relevant, along with this rehabilitation permit, which I think is important to have some knowledge of. But just as an example, certain exotic aquatic species, like think of like apple snails, for example, we restrict the possession of those animals for educational use. And so I've encountered educators that have, they want to have like examples of invasive species to use in their educational programs. Well, that's outside the scope of what we are covering today. And if you want any direction or have any questions about these other educational activities that we're not going to be covered today, but you think you might want some guidance on, I'd encourage you to reach out to me, and I can always route you in the correct way. So I think it's important to start with some legal foundations. I'm going to try to get through this quick and really nail in what's important. It can be a lot of information, but I'm going to try to, help digest this information and really tell you what's important to extract from this. So when we're talking about the relevant laws and regulations for wildlife education, I think it's important to see the full hierarchy of these laws and regulations in terms of what's the difference between a state law, an agency rule, and an agency policy. When I first started with the department, this is something that was very confusing to me, something that I didn't have much knowledge about. And so what I hope to do here is, give you a clear idea of what the difference from those three are, and, how these, laws and regulations fit into these different categories. So, to start with, we have state law, and state law is established by the legislature and provides, typically when it comes to these permits, a broader regulatory authority to be able to issue these permits, and we require legislative action to change these, which is a big task. It's not something that's done easily, and these laws are less flexible to change. Now, below that, we have various agency rules, which are developed through a formal rulemaking process, typically involving public input. And there are often times where state law is often broad, is that these agency rules are more specific to permit requirements and procedures and qualifications. And not to say it's an easy task to have these changed, but they can be more easily changed than state law is through commission action. And then we have agency policy, which oftentimes is, internal guidance for implementation, permit conditions and procedural details, things that can change based on department needs. So I'd just like to start with going over the relevant section of state law that we're going to be talking about today, which is Parks and Wildlife Code, Chapter 43, Subchapter C. You don't need to remember, that full sequence, but I would like to paint the idea that all of these permits that we're going to be talking about today, all of our authority to issue these permits come from, one area of state law. And there's a few important things about this section of law is, one, that it defines certain activities that require department regulation, which is the educational use of wildlife resources, but it's also going to go into, permit requirements for research, for zoological collections, and for rehabilitation. So all of the permits we're talking about today, educational and rehabilitation, are all going to be under the umbrella of Chapter 43C. It's also going to, establish which animals or which wildlife fall under our jurisdiction, specifically when it comes to this permit. We'll circle back to this later, as it can come across as a little bit complicated. And then, the other thing it does is it gives us authority to issue these permits. And so a key distinction I think is important to take away from this is we're going to find that this section of law really is focused on regulating the activity activities such as education and rehabilitation. And this isn't a section of law that actually establishes protections for wildlife. Rather, it's going to lean on some other provisions of law and agency rules to, establish that we regulate these specific wildlife groups and for this activity. Moving on from state
Ben,
law.
1 second.
Oh, yeah.
What slide? We were getting some feedback that maybe slides weren't advancing. What slide should we be seeing right now?
We're on the legal foundations slide. So
Thank you.
just to provide some context, because a lot of this is very dense information, I'm avoiding just cluttering the screens with a bunch of text right now. And so I'd encourage you just to, try to just digest this as an oral presentation. Otherwise, I think the slides are just going to get cluttered with citations to various law and regulations. So just a little clarity there. So, but thank you for asking. And so moving on to our agency rules here is, this is where it's going to set more specific requirements for educational display permits. Now, this is going to go into things such as, housing and care standards, reporting and record keeping requirements, permit application processes. A lot of this isn't going to be immediately relevant to master naturalists unless if you're interested in applying for a permit. But there are a few key takeaways. One, it defines educational purposes. This is kind of a complicated sentence, but it defines it as activities conducted for the purposes of encouraging management and conservation of protected wildlife, or furthering awareness and understanding among the general public of the biology of protected wildlife. So rather than having you memorize that phrase, I think the key takeaway is what master naturalists do with wildlife is for educational purposes, right? I think anything you do where you're engaging the public and teaching them about wildlife management or conservation, or teaching them about the biology of wildlife, that is what our department is going to consider educational purposes. Another key takeaway from these agency rules is going to be it establishes authorized personnel. And so this is going to be important, and we're going to focus more on this later in the presentation, that, there's going to be specific individuals that, if you find that you need a permit, that are going to be able to carry out activities. So that's the main takeaways I'd like you to take from this. And these are important to understand as they, really ensure we're being accountable through the permitting process, and creates a pathway for legitimate use of these resources for education. Now, a real important part of this that I said I was going to circle back to is, how do we know which wildlife species or groups we're talking about here? Because it's not going to be, just a blanket, any wildlife in Texas, right? It's going to be educational activities, which is generally what, if you're acting as a master naturalist and doing education, this is what you're doing. Educational activities involving protected wildlife. So as I mentioned earlier, essentially, what our law does is it leans on other provisions of state law and agency regulations. And to paraphrase what protected wildlife is defined as, is it's going to mean all indigenous vertebrates and all other indigenous aquatic life for which there is some provision in law or rule that would otherwise prohibit or restrict the take or possession of said wildlife. So key takeaways from this definition is, one, we're only talking about indigenous wildlife, and we're only talking about activities involving the take, possession, or otherwise the handling of wildlife for educational purposes, meaning that if what you're doing doesn't actually involve you coming into direct contact with animals, think if you're just going out and leading a bird walk or something like that, obviously you're not going to be coming into possession of these birds, and therefore you don't need a permit. So, that's really what we're talking about here is indigenous wildlife. And so when I say this definition of indigenous vertebrates and all other indigenous aquatic life, essentially what we're saying is anything that's not a terrestrial invertebrate. That's how I've taken this definition to mean And then, of course, that second part of that sentence is where we're actually, restricting some activities with those animals. So that brings up a whole bunch of questions, and where, so this gray area starts to expand, which is, what does that second part of the sentence mean? A provision in law or rule that otherwise prohibits the restriction or take of wildlife. Oh, essentially what we can do, what I've done in preparation for these types of presentations, I've gone through and I've said, well, what categories of protections exist? There's very obvious ones, think of threatened or endangered species, birds and bats and game animals. There's very clear categories that exist, and we can say, oh yeah, we obviously have restrictions on these animals. So clearly, when you're doing stuff with these animals, you're going to need a permit if what you're doing is, an educational activity. But there's other categories that really starts to expand the various groups that we're, taking in as, this is a group of wildlife that you're going to need a permit for, such as all the different non-game animals. Think of, common small mammals are herps. The question I get a lot is, what do I need a permit to do these activities with these turtles or small mammals or something like that? And well, to put it simply, is really when we go through and we start to look at all these different groups, what I've come to is, if we're talking about live wildlife, is if it is a vertebrate and it is indigenous and it is alive, then you're most likely going to need a permit to be able to engage in educational activities. I think the gray area really starts to expand when we go into invertebrates. I've mentioned, the permits clearly don't apply to terrestrial invertebrates, but aquatic invertebrates, that encompasses many different taxa. And what I would say is, there's situations where we obviously need a permit. Highly regulated aquatic invertebrates, such as, certain shellfish and crustaceans, these obviously require a permit by my understanding. And we can really get into the weeds as far as what about all these tiny invertebrates. And what I can say right now is, we're not strictly requiring a permit for those. Think of, like there's so many invertebrates that you can't even see with the naked eye, all these permits for tiny invertebrates or things that historically have like no regulations behind them. I don't think it's crucial that you feel like you need a permit for these activities. Rather, think of it for this encompassing group of vertebrates, along with these more protected invertebrates that are of course of aquatic. We're not talking about terrestrial animals here. Okay, so let's keep moving on here. So I'd like to just go into permit requirements and understanding, when are you going to require a permit as a master naturalist, and when can you just carry out your activities and educational programs without a permit? And so the way I think about it is, I think you want to first categorize it, or split it into categories rather, of living wildlife and deceased wildlife, and start to assess the programs you're involved in, and to determine, is what I'm doing legal without a permit, or do I need a permit for this? And so when it comes to live wildlife, there's a few questions you can ask yourself. One is it indigenous? If it's not indigenous, then you don't need this specific permit that we're going to be talking about. The other question is, is it alive? If it's alive and it's within this category of protected wildlife that we've talked about, then you're oftentimes going to need a permit. The other thing is, are you conducting educational activities, right? I don't want to scare anyone to think that, you need all of these permits, right? These permits are really tied to the educational activity itself. The mere possession of many of these animals is, oftentimes doesn't require a permit. But when you start to engage in educational activities, then the permit requirement comes in. And I should say specifically, are these activities available to anyone in the public? So that's an important question to ask, because if what you're doing, we talk to like public school teachers a lot that may have some, animal in the classroom that they're using for education, but because what they're doing is not available to the public, and in the animals that they're talking about don't require a permit merely for the possession of those animals. Think of like a turtle that you can go to the store and, with the appropriate license, the store can sell you that turtle. And so obviously anyone in the general public can possess these animals, and then a teacher goes and does this, these classroom educational activities, but it's not open to the public. So we don't need a permit in that situation. The other category to think of is deceased wildlife. And so the way to think about it with deceased wildlife is, can you ordinarily come into possession of these specimens legally? And so what I mean is, can you go out and collect these animals from the wild and possess them as deceased specimens? Think of fur-bearing animals, for example. You can, with the appropriate hunting license, go out and harvest these animals. And you can possess the furs and pelts of these animals without needing special permits. And because we say that you can possess these animals generally, in their diseased forms without a permit, we say that you can engage in educational activities without having to go through these permits. Really, the situations where we're interested in people having a permit for activities involving deceased wildlife is when you can't ordinarily possess these animals. And really, I think there are a few, big categories to pay attention to here. There's probably some one-offs aside from this, but I think these three categories encompass the majority of situations. Because you cannot legally possess parts of migratory birds, or really I should say non-game birds, bats, and threatened and endangered species. So these other deceased specimens that don't fall into these categories can legally be possessed and used in educational activities. And so that leads me into the next point of, when can you feel strongly that you don't need a permit? Because I think we'll find that many Master Naturalist chapters would not require a permit. So if you're primarily working with deceased specimens, there's a strong chance that you don't need a permit and that you can legally conduct these activities, being confident that you are being compliant with state law and our agency's regulations. Now, I think there's a lot of important points to discuss there in terms of you want to make sure that you are legally coming in to possession of these animals. What I'm getting at is making sure that if you're actually going out and collecting these animals, any person can go out and collect these animals and use those animals in educational activities, provided they're not one of these animals that exists in the category of birds, bats, and threatened and endangered species, and they can likely use those animals in as specimens for educational programs. But the important thing to keep in mind is if you're going out and collecting these from the wild, for example, there's legal requirements associated with that you need to make sure that you've met, such as, if that specimen still contains edible flesh, then you need to make sure that you have a hunting license, for example. And, you can't be collecting these animals from the side of the road or directly from the road because that activity is ordinarily illegal. So, and that can continue further into, well, what if I just, it's a real fur or, real pelt and I'm buying it from someone? Well, as long as they've met all the requirements to be able to legally sell that, that's fine. I would just encourage everyone to, keep the appropriate documentation of where you source that specimen from. So even if what you're getting from this presentation is say, I guess I don't need a permit, I'm just going to continue what I'm doing. I think it's important that if you're working with deceased specimens, that you understand what the requirement is to legally come into possession. As a reminder, you don't need to maintain special licenses or permits most of the time if you're just retaining specimen. I don't want you to think that, well, I got a license because I needed this license to be able to possess this this pelt because I use it in an educational booth. That's not what I'm saying. You know, think of it when you're actually going out and collecting the specimen from the wild. Is, you know, that's where we're talking about the license being required. If that animal still has edible flesh, and so on the other side of that conversation is, as when I've talked to law enforcement about this, they've told me that, you know, if the specimen doesn't contain edible flesh and it's one of these animals that you can ordinarily possess without a permit, you don't even need a hunting license to go pick it up. If, you know, you find a fully decayed bone or skull or something from a specimen in the wild, you can pick that up without needing a hunting license. But anyways, we could really get in the weeds about that. But when you're working with these deceased specimens, that's, I think, the takeaway is understanding, you know, what are the categories where you need a permit, or when is this activity ordinarily illegal, is when we're talking about, you know, highly protected groups such as non-game birds, bats, threatened and endangered species. You know, just to clarify, you know, legally harvested game birds and game animals, you know, preserved specimens, you know, antlers, mounts, etc., you know, in their deceased form can be used for educational programs without a permit. Okay, to keep going here, I want to make sure we have time for Lindsay. Is just a few example scenarios in to help you understand, you know, when these activities would require a permit. So example one is, you know, I lawfully come into possession of a living wildlife resource and maintain possession or custody of that animal. You know, can I go out and use that animal in an educational program that is available to the public? The answer is no, because it's alive, and assuming we're talking about an indigenous animal, you know, if it's one of these vertebrate animals or one of these protected aquatic invertebrates, then you would need a permit. You know, example number two, you know, we get this a lot. Someone will say, you know, hey, my neighbor or someone I know, they want to give me this red-eared slider that they purchased years ago, and they ask, you know, can I take custody of this animal and use it in an educational program? Well, you know, provided that that slider was legally purchased, there's no issue with you coming into custody or possession of that turtle. But if, you know, assuming we're talking about a living red-eared slider, is you can't just start using it in educational programs, because again, this is a regulated activity. You know, example number three is, you know, hey, I have, you know, real authentic furs and pelts that I use in my booth. Can I continue to use these in education without a permit? Yeah, likely, yes, you can continue using those specimens without needing a permit, you know, just provided that they were lawfully acquired. Example number four, a nature center has some old songbird feathers that they no longer have space for. Can I accept these feathers as a donation? No, you cannot, because you cannot possess the parts of non-game birds without first having acquired a permit. We can get into, you know, how these permits can authorize that here in the next slide. Another example is, can I go out and collect my own furs and pelts for education? You know, the answer is yes, as long as you've met a few check boxes. You know, first one is, you know, do I have the appropriate license if I'm going out and collecting specimens for that may still have some edible flesh on them? Do I have landowner permission? Is this happening on a roadside or directly from the road? If so, you know, you can't do that unless if you've received authorization to do so. So you can go out and collect furs and pellets and other specimens for education, as long as you are making sure that these are specimens that can be legally collected from the wild. Okay. To really quickly go over some of these permit requirements and an overview of this program is just, so the purpose and scope of an educational display permit is to authorize things that are ordinarily illegal, specifically things that are within the scope of educational activities. So all these things that I'm telling you, you need a permit for, well, this is the permit that we issue to authorize these activities when they're done for educational purposes. You know, each of these permits is, you know, they're tailor-made to the situation. It's not like other permits or licenses where, you know, when you buy it, you know exactly what you're getting, right? We we essentially handwrite these permits and issue them based on what's being requested. And to go into a few other things, these permits can also provide additional benefits, such as allowing someone to receive donations. So donations can come from, game wardens or other permit holders. That example where, the nature center has, some non-game bird feathers. Well, if you have a permit, you can, sort of gain access to this network of permit holders that, can make available for you, these various specimens that ordinarily you wouldn't have access to. And same goes for law enforcement. Oftentimes they may be, they may be seizing possession of, these specimens in course of their duties as law enforcement, and they could potentially even donate these specimens to permit holders. And so we don't need to get into the nitty-gritty as far as what is the full application process, but I want to give you an outline of the core components here, which is simply just, filling out an application form, painting 2 letters of recommendation, creating an educational outline for the activities that you're seeking the permit for, and submitting a $53 payment. And if the permit is issued and approved, then it's valid for 3 years, and you can continue to renew that permit from year to year. And one important point with these permits is that no hunting license or frankly no other permit or license is required when you are being authorized to conduct activities under one of these permits. So once we issue it under a permit, it's the only permit you need for those specific activities. Now, I would like to go into chapter level implementation recommendations here, but I want to quickly turn it over to Lindsay so that she can go ahead and talk about her program. Lindsay, go ahead and take over.
Okay, can everyone hear me okay? I know that there was some feedback before, but it sounds like it's gone now.
It's
Good?
much better. Thank you,
Much
Lindsay.
better?
Yep.
Okay, good. Thank y'all so much. Briefly, I know this presentation is mostly going to be focused on education because a lot of our master naturalists will do education, pop-ups and teach the kids about a lot of good things, have a lot of cool stuff out at their booths. But I just wanted to touch really quickly on the wildlife rehabilitation program because that is something that we've gotten a couple of questions on from master naturalists that have completed the course. And so I just wanted to give a quick overview of this. And my slide is just one slide. We can talk about it more. But for the wildlife rehabilitation program, this is a permit that we issue that, covers the activities of people permitted individuals that are going to be providing medical care to injured or orphaned animals. I think the main thing that I would like for Texas Master Naturalists to remember is that when you're speaking to the public, the best thing to do when people have questions and ask you about what do I do with this baby bird I found, or I found this baby raccoon, I'm keeping it at the house, what should I do? I think for you guys, as an extension of us, it's great that you can let people know that, hey, the main thing to do is first of all, contact an authorized wildlife rehabilitator in your area. Make sure you get that animal to them because they have the proper training. They have the proper resources that can give that animal the best chance at release. Okay. So on this slide as well, ultimate goal is release back to the wild. We do have some rehabbers that do have animals that are considered non-releasables due to medical reasons, and they're able to keep those animals as wildlife ambassadors. That does have to go through an approval process with us. And that rehabber has to have been authorized and licensed for at least 3 years. I've also included here on this slide, we've got our regulations. I'm going to provide a link to our webpage here in the chat so that if anybody is interested in the wildlife rehabilitation program, you can definitely look at our resources on our webpage. But also, our word that what we're trying to really get out to everyone in the general public, and we really need y'all's help with this too, is that becoming a wildlife rehabilitator is not about keeping the cute animals at home and keeping them as pets, treating them as pets. Wildlife rehabilitation is really for release back to the wild. The animals are wild. They need to be back out in nature. Sometimes we do have to let nature take its course. but the best thing is, you know, to try and spread the word that rehabilitation, the purpose of that is for release. And then also, just to let y'all know, for the application process, it is, we require a couple materials from that. We have, first of all, the wildlife application, rehabilitation application that can be found on our webpage. Also, there is an exam that is attached to the application. It's a 10 questions. You have to get 100 on it. If you miss any questions, we can always try again. It's not a hit or miss, you know, deny instantly kind of thing. You can keep trying. But then there also has to be a letter of recommendation from a wildlife rehabber that can attest to your abilities as a rehabber, you know, say that you're good because you've done this so many, you've volunteered for so many hours, you've worked with these types of animals, you've trained under them. We do need that recommendation. We also need a letter from a licensed veterinarian that is required, because that is showing us that the vet has agreed. They have put their name on it. They're saying that they will work with the rehabber in case any issues come up medical wise, that they have to perform a surgery or do anything like that. So, you know, as a Texas Master Naturalist, you are able to be a sub permittee under a wildlife rehabber, that they would register you as a person that could work with them. You can also volunteer, and that's great ways to be able to get experience in case this is something that you might want to do in the future, by being an authorized rehabilitator yourself. We do require game warden inspection. Our game wardens do have to inspect any one person's facility before their permit is issued. They do have to get approved from the game warden. And then also, game wardens are able to inspect any facility at any time. So, you know, a lot of our rehabbers work out of their own homes. And I think the game wardens, you know, that's something that some people, you know, they accept that, and they accept the fact that the game warden, if you list your house as your facility, the game warden has the ability to go in there and check on the animals and go through your home when needed, just to see where the animals are and see their conditions. And then let's see, for the rest of rehabilitation, anything, we do allow migratory birds, but if anybody is going to be rehabilitating migratory birds, you do have to have a federal permit. So that is something that even if you get federal birds listed on your permit from us, you can't handle migratory birds until the federal U.S. Fish and Wildlife Migratory Bird Permits Office has issued you your own rehabilitation permit as well. So they've got their own restrictions on that. And yeah, so that's something that people don't really realize when they apply, but we do include it there on our information page for our website. So if anybody has any questions regarding you know, wildlife rehabilitation after this, we can definitely discuss that further, but I just wanted y'all to have a little bit of a background on it in case that's something you might be interested in. I think I also saw in the chat that people were wondering about Ben and I's background and kind of education. And just to let everyone know, my education is, I have a degree in environmental science and policy with a concentration in biology. So I've worked with state regulations since 2012 because I worked for an environmental agency before, and then I was able to have some time working with sea turtles, and then got to come into Parks and Wildlife and do my ultimate dream of working with state regulations and wildlife. So if anyone has any further questions about rehabilitation, or any questions about, you know, coursework, if you're interested, things like that, you can feel free to ask me later on in the presentation. Thank y'all.
Awesome. Thanks a bunch, Lindsay. And so what I'd like to do, I know we still have a Q&A session, so I just want to go into really quick, just a few recommendations here for, you know, how you as a chapter can think about it. And so, you know, the best practices I think that you can do as a chapter is to, you know, sort of every once in a while do an audit of your educational activities, and you know, try to think if they would require a permit. And I'll be giving my contact information later, and you can always send me an email, and just you can list out the activities that y'all do. Say, here's what our chapter does, and I can give you, you know, the yay or nay if permits can be required for that sort of stuff. You know, another thing is that, you know, oftentimes, while we can't issue like one permit for the entire, Texas Master Naturalist program as a whole, we can issue chapter by chapter permits to allow multiple individuals to be covered. There's strict requirements for who can be authorized under a permit, and what it comes down to is just deciding as a chapter if you want to manage it as well, first off, decide if you need a permit in the first place, and if you do need a permit, think about who would be managing that permit. If you want to try to have multiple permit holders, I'd probably recommend against that. Think about who would be a good person that would be a good long-term fit. We can't transfer these permits, so you can't be moving around names from year to year. But thinking about who's a good person to manage this and who would be able to manage it and, authorize other individuals, we need to be listing out names on a permit. So I think that's all good stuff to get into. If you decide you need a permit, get in touch with me and we can go into that in more detail. But I think it's really important that you're considering who are you listing as the permit holder in an application if you do end up needing a permit, because we can't transfer these, and needs to be someone who can actually act in more or less like a supervisory capacity for these activities. And another thing is, if you decide you need a permit, make sure you're thinking about creating these systems for compliance. It's very common for permit holders to go out of compliance because oftentimes they're focused on this important work, understandably, and they're so focused on that they forget about reports and other requirements of the permit. So make sure you're understanding what you need to do to be compliant. Consider having some sort of internal training requirements before you allow individuals in your chapter to utilize these permits, and really try to find a record keeping system that works for y'all. We're here to also provide resources and support. So I'll be giving my contact information along with Lindsay's on the next slide here. But if you have questions, you can also get in touch with game wardens. They are our law enforcement branch. Me and Lindsay do not enforce laws, right? That's not our responsibility. And so I would encourage you to get permit and law enforcement guidance either from permitting officers here at Texas Parks and Wildlife or game wardens. I know many of you may be in contact with various Texas Parks and Wildlife biologists, but because those individuals aren't working with these regulations to the same extent we are, we'd encourage you to get that guidance from us, and we'd be glad to provide some online resources as follow-up to this. And we will update the community whenever there's any sort of regulatory changes. And when you're unclear about a situation, you can always get in touch with me or Lindsay or our local game warden. So if you're ever unclear, I encourage you to reach out. And so with that, I would like to go into a Q&A session here. And let me just go ahead and move to our contact information. Michelle, I'll have to lean on you I don't know how these ordinarily go.
Yeah, so this is great. This is actually one of the questions that were in the chat. Is if you could share your contact information, and I wanted to make sure of how you wanted to do that, and you've done it, so that's great. Another question we received was just more resources. One person asked, where can they find a list of permits that they might need in different scenarios?
Yeah.
Or is there a resource that exists?
Yeah. It's a great question, and I'll admit our resources on our website for these permit programs isn't fantastic. We have severe staff limitations, and because of that, the resources available aren't quite what we want. Although we are gradually working on making those more plentiful. Something that we're working on is getting more staff into this program so that we can create more online information. Like, think about, we have plans to make helpful one-pagers where you can clearly maybe establish like what are common issues we see in the educational community, and how do you know if you might need a permit. So we'll be working on those, and I'll make sure to get in touch with Michelle when those materials become available, so that she can advise on how to make that best available to y'all. We do have some basic information about these permits on our website, and we can also provide links to that. But in all honesty, I think it would be best to make sure that you're getting accurate information in the current state of what our website looks like, to get in touch with me if you have educational questions about your chapter, and Lindsay if you have any rehab questions, because we are actively working on that, and we're in the middle of updating some of our permit programs. We just haven't got into these educational permits yet and updating that guidance yet. So hopefully that answers the question. It's sort of a non-answer in the sense that we don't have strong resources, but if you have questions, you can contact us directly. We have all of our game wardens listed by county on our website, and same for rehabbers. Certain rehabbers have volunteered to have their information made publicly available, and you can find their information on our website. And then, of course, go to our permit pages for some basic information about those programs, such as application requirements and forms.
One of the questions that kind of came in as we were talking, I think you had mentioned the new permits online. What could you tell us a little bit about when that one might be ready?
Yeah, so are you saying the online implementation of these programs? Yeah, so we're working on implementing our scientific research permits to an online program. So we're in the midst of that and launching it later this year. And after that, we'll decide which program will be next. And it's likely going to be one of Lindsay's programs. Probably, not to speak on your behalf, Lindsay, but likely the rehab permit, I'm thinking, will go online. And depending on the complexity of these programs, like the scientific permit has been very complicated. It's such a complicated program that the implementation in the online space has been difficult. But I think these programs, due to similarities, will be easier and easier to implement. So I don't want to overpromise anything. I would hope in the next several years that we'd have at least started the process of moving the educational program online. But it really depends, it depends on our information technology division's availability, and, they have certain priorities, and, it's kind of a competition amongst the various programs in our department to see, who's going to be having their programs go online next. But I don't have a solid timeline, but it's something that's going to be actively worked on over the next several years.
And just to add to that, or Ben, can you mute your mic really quick? Because I think is that helping? Okay, good. Just to add to that too, yes, as y'all can imagine, some of our databases, things that Ben and I are working off of once we got into these positions are definitely a little bit old school. They're not keeping up with technology as much nowadays. So our department is trying to help us by helping us create new systems and new databases. But as you can imagine, with the state, it does take some time. So it will be next for me, will be rehabilitation, but it's going to take some time before we get that on an online system. I know that some people are having some questions regarding wildlife rehabilitation when it comes to like education. There is a training course. There's approved training courses that people have to take if they want to become a wildlife rehabber. They just have to take one and send us a certificate of completion. And then every time that they renew their permit after 3 years, the rehabilitation permit is valid for 3 years. Every time they renew it, they have to include a certificate showing that they completed another training course that's approved by our department. Those training courses have been on there for a while now. I've been trying to work with our department on trying to get them updated to put some new courses on there, add some additional ones. But also, that takes some time too, because that's going to be a change to our web pages that has to go through leadership approval, higher ups, much higher than me. So we're working on that too. But right now, as it stands, per regulations, you do have to have a training certificate from one of our approved courses showing that you finished that course when you're wanting to apply or renew.
One of the questions that's relative to that answer there is there's a question about a shadow process. Is there a mentor or a shadowing process that's required as part of that licensing?
So that's an interesting one, because I've heard that from several people. So I think that was something that was put in place in the past, but it's no longer required. Now I think with the regulation changes, gosh, back in maybe 2019 or it was a couple of years before me, I think that has been taken out of the regs. So now you are just required to have a letter of recommendation from a wildlife rehabber. So that would mean if a rehabber is going to speak on your behalf, you probably need to volunteer with them at some point. You need to be able to have worked with them because they have to attest to your abilities as a rehabber, and they have to be able to say why you would make a great rehabber in Texas. And like I said, also a licensed veterinarian, because we do have a lot of people that volunteer with their vet clinics. You know, some of them will help out there. Some of them will work for the vet clinic and then want to be a rehabber themselves. And a vet letter can also be a recommendation. So the vet can also, as long as they can attest to your abilities, that we can accept that as well. But then also the vet letter is going to be a separate piece of material too, where we need to have a letter also from the vet saying, I will be your consulting veterinarian. So those are two separate items that we'll need. I think I got,
Lindsay, there's a list of rehabbers on your website as well, correct? So
correct.
So looking for that.
She shared that in the chat.
Right. So I put that link as well, because if you do go to our webpage where we discuss wildlife rehabilitation, you know, it has a link to our regulations, which we always recommend anybody, if you're looking to be a rehabber, go ahead and read the regulations fully first so that you understand what you're applying for, what you can and can't do. Because on the application, you will be checking a box that says you have read the regulations and you understand. We find a lot of times that people don't read the regs and they get caught doing certain things that they weren't aware of, but at the same time, they signed a government document stating that they did read the regulations and they were aware of that situation. But on that web page, you also have a link to, I believe it says, it's towards the bottom, and it should say how to locate a rehabber in your area. Let's see, the exact language says how to contact wildlife rehabilitators in Texas. So if you click on that, it's going to show you a web page talking about wildlife rehabbers in Texas, but then there's also going to be a link on the next web page that says wildlife rehabilitator by county. And that way you can click on that. You can click on the county that you're in or surrounding counties, because some counties might not have a rehabber listed. But also just know that just because someone's a wildlife rehabilitator doesn't mean they're going to be listed on there, because that is public information. We're not allowed to give public information out unless the rehabber or unless an individual has given us permission. Excuse me. So the people you see listed on the wildlife rehabilitators page for certain counties, those people are listed because they have given us permission to put their name out there. And so just remember that social media might be a helpful way to find rehabbers as well. Be careful about finding rehabbers that way though, because if they do claim to be a rehabber, a lot of them aren't. You can always reach out to me to validate, you know, to check and see if a name that pops up and you're interested in working with them. You can check with me to see if they are actually a permitted rehabber, and I can verify that for you. But at least we have a web page right now that lists some of our rehabbers that have been on there for a while and have been in the rehab business for a good amount of time. Anything else for me?
I don't see any other questions for you, Lindsay. Lots of kudos for both of y'all. Really timely information for our master naturalists as they engage in a lot of these programs this spring and into their training classes. So a lot of thanks from the chat. Michelle or Hannah, were there any other questions that you wanted to grab first?
So there's one in the chat here, relatively recent. If either of you could talk a little bit about bird banding, and in connection, what would people who are bird banding, do you require a TWPD permit for that, and or what other permits might be required, permits and training? Oh, I think Ben, you might be, you're on mute.
Sorry, thank you. So yeah, you know, bird banding, like if you're actually going out and capturing birds, you know, you're going to need a permit for that, right? You know, non-game birds are highly protected under state law. I think a lot of people overlook the state law because everyone's focused on the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, or, you know, these federal laws that are, you know, more there's more public awareness for these federal regulations, I would say. But under state law, you can't, trap or come into possession of a non-game bird. And so that would include misnetting or other means of capturing migratory birds and other birds that, people may be doing banding activities on. So, oftentimes we issue that under a scientific permit. We could, if someone was doing like banding demonstrations for the public as part of the scope of their educational activities, we could authorize that under an educational permit. These permits, because I mentioned earlier, they're essentially handwritten and customized to the situation. They all look similar, but the fine wording on what we're authorizing is made by, either me or Lindsay. And so because of that, we can authorize next to anything on these permits that's within our jurisdiction. So we can authorize everything from, basic salvage authorizations to working with, threatened and endangered species. There's a lot of flexibility. And so, and under these permits, whether it's a scientific permit or an educational permit, people can conduct bird banding if authorized. But yes, that is an activity that would strictly require a permit. And also keep in mind, parts of non-game birds and the plumage of non-game birds, there are, you may not possess those sorts of specimens without a permit. So, bird feathers that come from birds other than game birds cannot ordinarily be possessed without a permit.
A follow-up question to that, Ben. In that scenario, does someone have to be permitted as a sub-permittee, or do they need their own permit?
Yeah, so I'll really try to give a quick summary of sub-permittees and how that relates to my permits. It's a little different than Lindsay's, but to answer your question, yes, that can be done as a sub-permittee, but there's a few important points to remember. So let's say that someone has a permit, whether it's an educational permit or a scientific permit, and we can use bird banding as an example, but this will apply to really any permitted activities. If you're listed as a sub-permittee and you've received written authorization from the permit holder, then you can go out and conduct those activities independently. Now what you can't do as a sub-permittee, at least for my programs, can't speak for rehab, it's slightly different there. But if you are a sub-permittee, you can't go out and start, bringing on volunteers with you and supervising them, right? That can only be done by the permit holder. So let's say someone, you're under their permit, and you're like, hey, well, I'll go out with, Joe or Sally, whoever it is, and we're going to go do these permit activities. Well, unless if they're also listed on the permit, they can't be involved in those activities. The other side to that is if the permit holder is there and supervising, then they can involve what's called an unpermitted assistant, which is someone that's not named on the permit, but is under the supervision and direct on-site supervision of the permit holder. And they can start to bring in these unpermitted assistants that you don't have to go through the process of actually naming them on the permit. So that's why I wanted to go into more detail, but I didn't want to spend too much time on it, when it's really important to decide who is the permit holder for a chapter, because that's the only individual that can, supervise people that aren't named on the permit. Otherwise, everyone engaging in permitted activities needs to actually be named on the permit. So hopefully that's answered the question. If you are actually named on that permit, you can engage in those activities if the permit holder has, given you that authorization to do so.
Ben, I'll chime in if you want to mute. For just to touch on sub-permittees for the wildlife rehabilitation program, just so y'all know, there's a difference between volunteering and being a sub-permittee. So as a volunteer, you don't have your name necessarily on the permit. But you can do smaller activities at the facility, the rehab facility, where you're kind of cleaning out cages. You're under constant supervision from either a listed sub or the permit holder themselves. So you're doing kind of more of the custodial work at a rehab facility. But if you become a sub-permittee, that means the permit holder has requested you be added to their permit as a sub, which is something that we approve as well. And we have to update permits to get your names listed on there specifically. But as a sub-permittee, you're basically able to you're kind of the right-hand man for the permit holder. you're able to do the feedings, you're able to be there with them on site. You can help manage some of the volunteers. It's whatever the primary permit holder is going to allow you to do at their facility. A sub-permittee can handle that. But just remember that when you're kind of outsourcing, trying to find someone to sub under, if that's what you want to do, that rehabbers have the ability to put their own restrictions on any sub-permittees or volunteers, okay? So just because you've requested to be their sub-permittee doesn't mean it's going to automatically be approved by Parks and Wildlife. We have to have, the primary permit holder has to be the one saying, I do want this person on here. They're going to be working under me. And if that means the primary permit holder is requiring you to, you know, do your own extra logs or extra, you know, timesheets or things like that, they can basically put whatever they need, whatever they feel they need for their facility in place, any kind of requirements. So they might require certain training from you, some additional training. You know, there's just there's some primary permit holders that will do that because you are going to be under their name. So they want to make sure that whoever's working with them as the primary permit holder is going to be liable for any actions of their subs or their volunteers. So just keep that in mind, have some grace if you're talking with rehabbers and they're kind of, you know, you're shopping around and some might be a little more restrictive than others. Just keep that in mind that they can do that. Okay.
We're a little bit over an hour, and I appreciate y'all staying on to answer the extra questions that have come in. I'd like to thank you, Ben and Lindsay, again for the information today. And like you mentioned, it's a very complex web that you weave or are required to weave with all the regulations and statutes that revolve around not just this area, but all of the areas that you work in. So thank you for taking time out of your schedule today to share this information with our Master Naturalists. And we will have the recording available tomorrow on our website for those that have missed it. And thank you again.
Sure, it was our pleasure, and thank you, Michelle, Mary Pearl, and Hannah for all you do, as well as all the Master Naturalists for what you do out in supporting wildlife education. So we'd be glad to come back and do this again sometime later down the road too.
Thank you.
Please feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions. Shoot us an email. I did include in the chat that Ben and I do get a lot of calls and a lot of voicemails that we have to return on a daily basis, so we can't get to everyone through phone pretty quick. But if you do send us an email, we can probably get to you a lot faster, or we can set up a time to talk with you so that we can kind of fit that into our schedule as well. So feel free to ask us any questions, anything you might have. If you read the regulations and get confused on something, that's what we're here for. And thank you all for everything you do out there for us as well.